So welcome everyone to the webinar, The Value of Water in Canada. My name is Roy Brouwer, Executive Director of the Water Institute here at the University of Waterloo. Very happy to see you back, in some cases again. Before we start the webinar, I want to acknowledge that I participate today from traditional territory of the Neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land that was granted to the Six Nations, and that includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River, as you can see here in the map. Our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is centralized within our Indigenous Initiatives Office. I encourage you to take a second to think about the territorial land where you are. Before I introduce the speaker of today, I just want to remind you that if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box, not in the chat, but in the Q&A, and then we'll get to the questions after the presentation. And without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce the speaker of today, Dimple Roy. She's the Director of Water Management at the IISD, which is the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And in this role, she leads IISD's work on water-related policy analysis, focused on integrated management of water and related resources in Manitoba, Canada, and globally. She also directs the Institute's Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions initiative in Canada, and her presentation will tell you a little bit more about that. With a background in environmental management, Dimple has over 20 years of experience in addressing public policy systems in the water sector, including on sustainable agriculture, natural infrastructure, watershed-based climate adaptation. Dimple sits on a number of boards and committees, including the International Red River Watershed Board of the International Joint Commission and the Expert Advisory Council for the Government of Manitoba. And as mentioned, her talk today is about natural infrastructure for water solutions. And I'm going to hand over the floor to you, Dimple. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Roy. Usually I start by giving a land acknowledgement of my own. I'm typically sitting in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. However, I am joining you today from just outside of New Delhi, India. So a bit later in the day here. Good afternoon to folks there, and thank you for joining today. I'm talking today, as Roy mentioned, about the Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions initiative led by IISD, or the International Institute for Sustainable Development. IISD, just as a quick introduction, is a think tank focused on accelerating solutions for a stable climate, sustainable resource management, and fair economies. And our work inspires better decisions and sparks meaningful action to help people and the planet thrive. We impact work across about 100 countries, including Canada. The Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions initiative that I'll be talking about today is a 5-year initiative that we launched in 2022. And this initiative is aimed at scaling up the use of natural infrastructure for meeting some of our critical water needs today, particularly on the Canadian Prairies. And we're working for this initiative, we're working with partners such as the Natural Assets Initiative, and together we're aiming to make natural infrastructure backed by evidence, adopted at local scales, financed and enabled by policy. I am going to get Julie to help me advance the slides, so you'll hear me say next slide. Thank you, Julie. A quick overview of my presentation today. I'll talk about natural infrastructure, and for those of you who are familiar with the term, you also know that there are many different terms out there that have very similar meanings. So I'll explain what we mean by natural infrastructure, what we're getting at with the term. I'll talk about our focus on the Canadian prairies and why we've particularly focused on the prairies. I'll talk a little bit about what's happening right now. What does natural infrastructure look like today on the prairies, and what does scaling look like into the future, particularly for water needs? And then I'll pivot a little bit on a specific aspect of our work. Given the theme of this webinar series, I'll be talking to you about some of our recent research related to finance, funding, and some of the analysis we've done looking at some of the economic implications of scaling natural infrastructure. And I'll just end quickly with a few notes about next steps. Next slide, Julie. So what do we mean by natural infrastructure? At IISD, we've talked about natural infrastructure on a bit of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum are ecosystems, natural areas that exist and already provide us with a host of really good benefits. And we talk about actively protecting and managing them for the benefits that they provide for humans, for some of our water infrastructure needs. So we're talking about conserving, for example, native prairie grasslands or wetlands, forested areas, urban green spaces. Along the spectrum is restored ecosystems. Here on the prairies, again, we've lost much of our natural infrastructure, natural area, natural ecosystems. Wetlands are a really good example. The prairies have lost about 70% of existing wetlands. And so we're talking about restoring ecosystems in order to get those infrastructure benefits that we care about. And on the other end of the spectrum is what we call engineered ecosystems. So these are essentially man-made, recreated natural areas. Think green roofs, think floating treatment wetlands where you have pads that are sitting on deeper water systems and have wetland plants growing on them that act just like natural wetlands and simulate the properties of natural ecosystems. Our tagline for the Natural Infrastructure for Water Solution, or NEWS initiative, as we call it, is to take natural infrastructure from novel to normal. So right now, the way we see it, natural infrastructure is a bit of a novelty. It's being applied as a form of innovation to meet some water needs. What we want to get at, possibly not in 5 years, but what we're aiming at is a future where we really see natural infrastructure as a normal part of our infrastructure toolkit. So just as we see engineers going to pipes and dams and built engineered systems, we want natural infrastructure part of that same toolkit into the future. Next slide, please. And what do we mean by water infrastructure solutions? So a few critical mandated infrastructure needs when it comes to water are drinking water treatment. Municipalities across Canada have the mandate to supply clean drinking water, and nature has a role to play. It doesn't replace traditional drinking water treatment facilities. However, there are many examples of source water protection or watershed management in order to really protect where our drinking water comes from and to mitigate some of the costs and technologies required for drinking water treatment. We're talking about stormwater management, so ensuring that our surface water is captured in the right way and that nature provides ways to manage our stormwater, ensure that we don't get polluted stormwater ponds and so on. We're talking about wastewater treatment as an infrastructure requirement. Again, many of our wastewater treatment plants are in fact engineered and built solutions, but they can be enhanced, sometimes replaced by treatment lagoons, treatment wetlands, and so on. And then finally, we're talking about mitigating the risks of climate change. So as part of infrastructure needs for Canadian communities, we need to make sure that we're de-risking our communities of extreme climate events, ensuring that we're preventing as much as possible impacts of floods and droughts and wildfire. And again, natural infrastructure has a role to play in providing some of those infrastructure needs. Next slide, please. So why the Canadian Prairies? The Canadian Prairies are a bit unique in the Canadian landscape. The prairies contain 80% of Canada's farmlands, are demonstrating many of those accelerated impacts of climate change. We're seeing a massive increase in the frequency and impact of climate events on the prairies, particularly floods. And our infrastructure, just like the rest of Canada, 30% of Canadian water infrastructure is in fair to very poor condition. And on the prairies in particular, investments are not keeping up with depreciation of current infrastructure systems. So we're seeing a widening gap on the prairies in particular, and we think this needs to be tackled sooner than later. The prairies is also a bit of a unique mix of small and medium-sized communities, not as many larger cities and municipalities as some of the other provinces in Canada, and yet this massive geography needs significant infrastructure systems with a low tax base, a low population density, a smaller piecemeal governance systems. And then I'll just highlight that watershed health, declining water systems, more events of algal blooms and eutrophication are common on the Canadian prairies. And on the social side, much like rest of Canada, we have significant inequities, not just between some of our Indigenous nations and rights holders, but also between municipalities, as I'd call them, the haves and the have-nots. The bigger municipalities that have capacity have already leveraged funding, and then some of the smaller municipalities that don't have the capacity or the ability to do what needs to be done to acquire some of those infrastructure solutions. Next slide, please. So we started the News Initiative in 2022, and some of our first efforts were to establish a bit of a baseline. We wanted to know what was going on the prairies. We've been working in this field for a few decades, but we did really want to take stock so that we ensured that we were addressing the most critical levers and barriers to scaling. And we published something called the State of Play Report for Natural Infrastructure in the Canadian Prairies. You can see the QR code on the screen. And a snapshot of what we found is there's lots of smaller projects across the board, small and bigger projects across the board. But right now, natural infrastructure is a patchwork of projects on this vast landscape. They're site-specific, and there aren't many projects that are really at scales that matter, if you will. So if we're talking about this being a normal way of tackling some of our infrastructure solutions, we have a long way to go. And as I've already mentioned, we've lost many of our natural assets. We do need to reduce and slow down the decline of loss of natural assets. The capacity issues that exist, the lack of capacity that exists in smaller municipalities is significant. And what's really needed is a pipeline of these natural infrastructure projects, a steady stream of these projects that are on the go so that we see a slow or rapid increase in natural infrastructure projects in the prairies. And gray infrastructure is still very much the norm. So when we're talking outside of our usual suspects, if we're talking to planners, we're talking to engineers, we're talking to CAOs of municipalities, they acknowledge the value of nature, they see a lot of benefit, but the go-to is to adopt engineered solutions, time-tested systems, and there's a lot of inertia for change. Next slide, please. So to give you a quick idea of what's already happening, we have a lot of this information in our State of Play report. Thanks, Brittany, for sharing information on that in the chat. So quickly, in Alberta, small and big natural infrastructure innovations. I'll highlight Parkland County upstream from the city of Edmonton. Much like the New York City example, a bit different, of course, but acknowledging that they are upstream of a big city and in many ways providing drinking water for 1.6 million people downstream. They conducted a natural asset inventory, took stock of what natural assets they had in their county, and identified some key opportunities to really conserve and restore some natural areas, make some investments, and get the best bang for buck. For example, they've invested in the restoration of a wetland. They've done some bioengineering on some banks to ensure that parts of their highways don't get washed out again and again from weather events. And they were able to do this because they conducted a natural asset inventory and found out what was happening. Similarly, the town of Okotoks, again, conducted a natural asset inventory. And in their case, they got some really tangible insights from that inventory. For example, they knew from that inventory that the value of their urban trees was $12.20 per tree per year. And the value of their wetlands is about $30,000 per hectare. So they were then able to use some of these insights for their stormwater mitigation, climate regulation, flow control, soil erosion prevention, and so on. So the natural asset inventory has become a key tool for communities to understand what their needs are, what's beneficial, and where they can invest into the future. Next slide, please. Saskatchewan, similarly, if you look at the report, you'll see a number of projects highlighted, and there's a bit of detail on each of these bubbles that you see on that diagram. The city of Saskatoon, similar to some of the earlier examples, conducted a natural asset inventory and found out that their about 7% of their land base is naturalized. And based on their inventory, they're working on a green network to provide the community access to high quality green space and improve wildlife habitat. And the asset inventory and their subsequent work on natural infrastructure has allowed the city of Saskatoon to be one of the recipients of the natural infrastructure funds that are being delivered by Infrastructure Canada. And this is a newer dedicated fund for natural infrastructure. And Saskatoon was well placed because of their prior work in taking stock to access this funding. And that funding has now allowed them to develop some food forests, plant trees that are particularly good for climate adaptation, biodiversity, and other community benefits. Next slide, please. And in Manitoba, again, lots of work going on in natural infrastructure. And the one noteworthy financial instrument that's highlighted in the orange text is the government of Manitoba has invested in a large endowment fund, a fund that's over $200 million in endowment, and the proceeds from that fund, about I forget the exact number, but in the order of magnitude of $7 or $8 million is given out every year for natural infrastructure projects. So what we're seeing is a rapid acceleration of natural infrastructure projects in Manitoba, which is great. I'll just highlight the rural municipality of La Broquerie has built, for example, a 40-acre tertiary treatment wetland to improve the quality of their treated wastewater. So they, in order to meet their 1 milligram per liter phosphorus emission regulation, they require this additional treatment, polishing treatment wetland, if you will. So that's an example of a natural infrastructure project in Manitoba. And of course, there are many others. City of Selkirk is well known for also its natural asset inventory and its adaptation plan and some of the fairly leading edge work that they're doing in the city of Selkirk. Next slide, please. So what we see in our future, what our vision is for the future is a resilient mix of natural and gray infrastructure. We acknowledge that natural infrastructure is not a silver bullet. It's not going to be able to meet all of our needs, but we do believe that moving more and more towards naturalized and natural solutions will in fact help us meet our needs at a faster pace, in a more cost-efficient manner, and provide us with a host of co-benefits. So while we're meeting our infrastructure needs, we can also ensure that we're meeting the needs of communities for access to green spaces, improved biodiversity, and so on. Next slide, please. And to take from some of our colleagues at the Intact Center, acknowledging that well-maintained, conserved ecosystems provide us with a whole host of benefits, They've created this mantra, and I repeat it in all of my presentations. Retain what you have, restore what you've lost, and build what you need. So kind of in that order of hierarchy, established ecosystems, of course, are clearly the best at providing us with many of these benefits. Restored ecosystems are good. And then as we're thinking about new infrastructure solutions, it's good to be thinking of ways to naturalize and have natural solutions in place as we move forward. Next slide, please. So what are some of the barriers? Again, going back to our State of Play report, we identified a few key barriers to scaling up. And our whole project and our insights are kind of broken into, on the left side is our implementing stream, if you will, where we talk about understanding of natural infrastructure and what kind of outcomes it provides, and adoption of natural infrastructure by communities. And there, some of the barriers are, in fact, quantifying specific benefits, ascribing specific values and beneficiaries to these outcomes. And then, as I've already mentioned, for the adoption side, some of the barriers are that gray infrastructure is still very much the go-to. There are some significant capacity challenges in moving, not just in understanding what solutions exist, but how to adopt them in practice. So capacity challenges along that whole spectrum of planning, implementing, and managing these systems over time. For example, a lack of procurement strategies at a very practical level. Communities do not have procurement strategies in place to incorporate natural solutions. On the other side, on the right side, is what we call our enabling stream of work, where we're talking about finance and policy. And here the barriers are that finance and funding is still very much biased towards implementation. There is a bit of an emphasis on shovel-ready projects, not as much on planning, collaboration, and even maintaining some of these natural systems over time. And we know from our own experience that these infrastructure solutions are not ones that you can set in place and forget about. They do require annual maintenance. They do require different ways of planning and management. And then just on the policy side, there aren't as many regulations that really incent and encourage the adoption of natural infrastructure. And one of the examples that we give is a limited ability to coordinate at larger scale. So at watershed levels or at beyond the municipal levels, there isn't a lot of, there are in fact policy silos and barriers to adoption at larger scales. Next slide, please. And on the flip side, there are opportunities. So I won't go over all of these, but clearly there is a lot of movement in the past number of years on natural infrastructure. There's a lot more understanding of the solutions. There is buy-in at the political and the public levels. And there is this understanding that co-benefits and a package of benefits is in fact a good thing to have. So there isn't anymore this idea that we have an infrastructure need and there should be a linear solution to solve it. In fact, we're starting to see many of these baskets of benefits being quantified, monetized, and funded in various ways. And I'll be talking about that in future slides. We're also seeing increased emphasis on some of these outcomes. So a need for climate adaptation, a need for improved biodiversity, more regional collaboration. So at the municipal level, there is some of these priorities have emerged as key priorities for municipalities. And that's, in fact, a good time for us to be talking about scaling natural infrastructure. On the finance end, there has been also a movement towards longer-term life cycle funding for projects. And on the policy side, I will say that there are some municipalities and jurisdictions, and even at the federal level, we have seen a carve out for natural infrastructure funding. And we hope to see more of this, but there are definitely opportunities and best practices to hold up. Next slide, please. Another one of our reports from last year, 2023, we released Natural Infrastructure and Prairie Prosperity Report. And this report essentially made a strong case for investment in natural infrastructure on the prairies. This work, led by some of my colleagues and with help from the Delphi Group, helped us talk about the current state of natural infrastructure and how natural infrastructure contributes to jobs and economic GDP in the prairies. So, for example, in 2022, the natural infrastructure sector, and you'll see the graphic on the side of the screen there that talks about direct and indirect jobs. So in 2022, our analysis showed that the natural infrastructure sector directly employed 33,400 people and contributed over $4.1 billion to prairie-wide GDP. In addition, the sector supported, or rather I should say in total, including some of the indirect jobs, the sector contributed over 58,000 jobs and contributed to over $7 billion in economic returns. And then the second thing that the report did was look into the future, talk about a business as usual scenario. So if we continue to see growth as we are seeing now, we're looking at increase of 13% in jobs and increase of 6% in GDP in the Canadian Prairies. Of course, if there is more investment, and of course, you can imagine we're making the case for more investment into natural infrastructure. So a $40 million additional investment will yield an additional 18 to 26% increase in jobs and 10 to 16% increase in GDP across the prairies. So we're really making the case for increased investment and showing what kinds of returns we can see. And we've already received some good feedback on this kind of messaging from some of our political counterparts who have acknowledged that this kind of analysis is useful to make the case within cabinet colleagues and for public consumption. So we're excited about that. Next slide, please. In a more recent funding brief that we published, I think it was about a couple of weeks ago, we talked about natural infrastructure providing us with, federal funds for natural infrastructure currently providing us with a certain magnitude of funding for natural infrastructure. So apart from the Natural Infrastructure Fund that's dedicated to natural infrastructure, we have a number of other infrastructure and environment-related funding that we looked at. And we calculated, this is not comprehensive, it is a bit of a snapshot. And the 16 federal funds together, the most prominent ones in this space, are providing us about $346 million of funding towards natural infrastructure, and an estimated $69.3 million of this is coming into the prairies. In addition, provincial funds are also contributing. I talked about the Manitoba Conservation and Growth Trust, for example. Combined with provincial funds, we're seeing about $98 or so million of investment into natural infrastructure on the prairies. So it's not significant. I guess the takeaway for us is that we aren't talking very small numbers anymore. It's very exciting to see the acceleration in public dollars into this space, but we're not there yet. $98 million for infrastructure is a fairly small amount. So when we're talking about meeting some of our critical infrastructure needs, adaptation needs, we're still seeing fairly small funding that's coming to the prairies. And then if we look at some of those biggest funds, the green municipal funds, the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program, et cetera, we're seeing fairly small portions of those federal funds being directed to the prairies. So once again, we're making the case that the prairies need to be attended to. We have a bit of a unique kind of fallback of access to funding on the prairies, and this is something that we're hoping to tackle through some of our efforts. Next slide, please. Another report that we had written before we initiated the news initiative, we talked about kind of the main sources of funding for natural infrastructure. And on the right side, you'll see we have private, public, and philanthropic funding. And the takeaway from some of the analysis that we'd done back in 2020 was that there are what we call different colors of money. So some natural infrastructure projects, the ones that have the most tangible benefits and can show the most direct revenue sources, are the ones that are most aligned with private sector financing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the ones that have the most non-monetary benefits, societal benefits that are not clearly ascribed to the projects, they're not clearly, beneficiaries can't be clearly identified, are the ones that lend themselves to philanthropic or public sector funding. So we started to look at this a few years ago already, where we're looking at different sources of financing so that we could talk about scaling up. And yeah, I have a few other things, but I'll leave it at that and maybe move on to the next slide, please. So a more recent report, again, we published this about a week or two ago, where we talked about financing for natural infrastructure, where my colleagues, Puzareva et al., talked about leveraging private sector financing, in particular for scaling up natural infrastructure. And they highlighted a few key mechanisms for natural infrastructure, relevant to natural infrastructure. The first, of course, is debt, which is your classic loans that require repayment. In this kind of mechanism, municipalities can issue bonds to attract private sector capital. And this is a mechanism that's a lot more common in the United States. So south of us, they're leveraging green bonds, and they have now emerging green banks, which are essentially set up to offer low-cost debt financing for things like clean energy and other green projects. The Connecticut Green Bank, for example, offers financing to environmental infrastructure. They call them environmental infrastructure projects, such as water, parks, and conservation projects. And in the US, statewide bonds measure and issue and sell bonds that support nature-based solutions and natural infrastructure. So this is getting to be more commonplace across the United States, particularly at the state level. The equity mechanism is a bit different. This is where the investor provides capital for implementation of the project and for a share of ownership in the project. Again, in the United States, our examples are more prominent. Ecosystem Investment Partners in the US is a private equity firm that invests in ecological restoration projects and provides credits to offset private sector environmental impacts. So a slow emergence of equity offerings in the natural infrastructure space, but slow to make its way into Canada. We do have a few examples, but not many. Grant funding is probably the most common, and I've already mentioned some of the federal grants that we have in place. So these are obviously program-based funds that are allocated for certain types of activities or types of outcomes, and they do not need to be repaid. There isn't as much of a drive to leverage private sector financing. However, more and more government funding is looking for matching dollars, looking for ways for project proponents to pull together different kinds of funds. And then the final one, performance-based funding, in some ways can be aligned with any of the others. There's a clear acknowledgement of a specific outcome. So a range of funding institutions, public, private, philanthropic, have specific measurable environmental outcomes and will provide funding for those. So the ALICE program in Canada, across Canada, is an example of this, where they're looking for specific outcomes and will provide grants or other forms of funds for those specific outcomes. Next slide, please. I have a few financial instruments that we talked about in our recent report as well. I'll just go over them really briefly. These are ones that are really emerging also in Canada, and some of them lend themselves quite well to natural infrastructure financing and implementation. Carbon credits is one of them. Carbon credits, many of you will know, are tradable permits that generally kind of revolve around carbon dioxide equivalents as the tradable unit. So engaging in activities with a clear understanding of emissions reduced can allow you to participate in a carbon credit or a cap and trade system. These have been around in Canada for a few years now. So in 2018, many of these markets were emerging in places like BC, Alberta, Quebec. And now with the federal government's emphasis on carbon tax and with a general kind of regulation, we have at the federal level the GHG Pollution Pricing Act that came into effect in 2018 and allows for carbon markets to emerge across the country. These are a potential source of financing natural infrastructure projects because we're seeing many natural infrastructure projects, in fact, providing clear, measurable reduction in carbon emissions or a way to store carbon in the soil, for example. So the prairies with a large agricultural base is a candidate for this kind of mechanism. Next slide, please. Similar to carbon credits, we have biodiversity credits. So with a global emphasis on mitigating biodiversity loss, there is a bit of a resurgence of biodiversity credits. This often allows companies, again, to mitigate some of their own environmental impacts and invest in projects that can give them a similar gain as what they may have lost through their own company activities. Many of these systems are voluntary rather than mandatory. Biodiversity credits are infamously hard to quantify and verify. So unlike carbon credits that have created, established systems of measurement and have developed the carbon dioxide equivalent as the unit of trade, biodiversity credits are much harder to quantify and kind of implement, but they can be combined with other systems like carbon systems. Canada does have a draft offsetting policy for biodiversity. There's quite a bit of emphasis on this since the the Montreal COP that happened a few years ago. Canada is quite engaged and is one of the leaders in talking about mitigating biodiversity loss. So again, a real opportunity for us to leverage some of this attention and momentum for natural infrastructure. Next slide, please. Outcome-based financing is essentially systems where outcomes are very, very clear and investors provide financing for implementation costs and beneficiaries then pay for outcomes of the natural infrastructure project, generating a revenue stream to repay investors. This model is definitely something worth exploring on the Canadian Prairies. There's quite a bit of interest and excitement. In Canada, an example of outcome-based financing is the Deshkan Zibi Conservation Impact Bond that was launched in March of 2020 that raised about $130,000 through a legally binding loan over 3 years at 5% interest. And this was done to restore 150 acres in Carolinian Zone in Ontario. So we are seeing a bit of momentum. And these sorts of projects typically involve an implementing partner, an intermediary. So the diagrams that you're seeing on the screens, sorry, I forgot to mention it for the previous slides, kind of lay out the kinds of roles and the systems that need to be in place for these to happen. And outcome-based financing has various intermediaries and verification systems and investors kind of laid out in the way that we understood it. So in the Canadian example that I took earlier, there were 5 pay for success metrics that were selected for evaluation that are worth mentioning. There were a number of hectares of habitat improvement, number of people engaged in learning about the land, number of intercultural and cross-sectoral economic opportunities, nature connectedness, and the quantity and quality of ecocentric sightings. And you'll find more information on this in our report, but they have described the specific outcomes that they've prioritized in that region and found ways to clearly quantify and monetize these. Next slide, please. A few other instruments. Insurance is a well understood one. And the insurance sector in Canada has been quite active in the natural infrastructure field. Mostly because of the rising costs of insurance in the last decade or so. I think I mentioned this earlier on one of my slides. We've had a massive increase. I believe the costs incurred due to flooding on the Canadian prairies has increased tenfold in the last decade. This means that insurance companies are quite engaged. They're looking at ways to reduce some of the insurance costs and payouts, and are investing in some natural infrastructure projects. And they are piloting insurance products like parametric insurance and risk reduction related insurance programs that really focus on outcomes being a reduction in risk or damage to communities from some climate events. Natural asset companies are a bit unique, again, much more common in the US. In 2021, the New York Stock Exchange launched a new asset class, and this is called natural asset companies. And the aim is to raise capital for natural assets and natural infrastructure by creating long-term equity that can be traded in the capital market. So just like we have private sector companies being traded, stocks being traded in capital markets, natural infrastructure assets are also slowly making their way into capital markets. So again, something worth keeping an eye on, but definitely slow movement and requirement of a lot of kind of systems set up to ensure transparency, expertise, monetization, and long-term revenue generation. Next slide, please. Thanks, Roy. So what are some of the key insights from our work? So many of these reports that are highlighted highlight really a few key things for us, especially when we're talking about finance and funding for scaling up of natural infrastructure. Clearly, we need to think about quantifying and monetizing these benefits. And there's a lot of momentum here. We ourselves are helping funders, for example, the Conservation Trust and Grow Trust in Manitoba. We work with them to establish kind of quantified outcomes from activities. So to translate on the ground activities like hectares of wetlands restored into specific societal benefits, water infrastructure outcomes that we care about, such as cleaner water. Other funders, such as Environment Canada, are moving also in the same direction. Globally, there are standards that are being established for quantifying benefits and monetizing. Engaging beneficiaries is a critical need to move forward in this space. It is essentially something that involves people and communities, and a direct line to the beneficiaries of these projects makes the success of the projects a much higher chance of success, essentially. Establishing roles and establishing trust takes time, but for many of these systems, there are some clear roles, clear kind of systems that need to be in place, and there is a need for expertise, there's a need for enabling policy, financial systems, etc. And finally, something that we're tackling within our own work is ways to address some of the inequity and access issues that exist across the Canadian prairies, of course, across the rest of the country. And of course, everything we're doing on the prairies is treating the prairies as a bit of a pilot test case, if you will. A lot of what we're talking about is also applicable to other parts of Canada, but we are using the prairies as a bit of our test case. Next slide, please. Sorry, so just going back to some of those financial instruments I talked about, the ones that are most promising for the Canadian prairies, we did do some analysis. And as I said, carbon credits are probably one of the most promising, as are outcome-based financing models, where we're starting to see more funders caring about clearly identified outcomes, and then insurance systems that are kind of taking off in our region. Next slide, please. So that was a whole bunch of information from a lot of research and efforts that we've done across the last couple of years. I'll end with next steps. So where are we going from here? This year, we've talked about being the year of people, pilots, and policy. We know that much of the scaling that we're talking about cannot happen without people. So some of our efforts in this space are collaborating with local implementing partners. We're also working with what we call champions. So people, individuals, and institutions that really have a critical role to play in scaling natural infrastructure will be our allies heading into the next couple of years of our initiative, so that we can enable them to take this work forward even after the end of our initiative. We want to make sure that we work with the CAOs and the watershed managers and the engineers that are actually implementing some of these infrastructure solutions. This is the year of pilots. We're fortunate to have a funder that's allowing us to experiment. And so we are going to be looking at piloting. For example, we've already initiated some policy pilots looking at how silos, how we can kind of de-silo some of the efforts on the ground. We're looking at some implemented pilots where we're looking at how some of the local natural infrastructure projects impact local communities and their own resilience, and how we can use communication to build peer-to-peer learning from municipality to municipality. On the policy front, we've been keeping an eye on some of the federal policies, some of the municipal and some of the local policies. And this is the year we're hoping to kind of really pull some of that information together and target our own opportunities and advocacy moving forward. So it's another busy year. You'll see us active in various ways. If you're interested, next slide, please. Our next slide has a QR code for our Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions webpage, where we will find all of those reports that I talked about. I know Brittany's been sharing them along the way, but you will find more information there. Please sign up for our newsletter that we put information on every month. Lots of resources, not just from us and our work, but from many other partners across the prairies and beyond. We're always trying to bring good information to bear in our efforts to scale. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you for going a bit over time, Roy, and over to you.
Not a problem at all. Thank you so much, Dimple. That was very, very interesting. And you and your organization are clearly very, very active in this field with all these different reports. Thanks also very much for sharing the links to those reports. We have some time, 10 minutes for question and comments. So please use the Q&A box. I don't see anything at the moment. So I'll start myself, and then in the meantime, if a question pops up in your head, please enter it in the Q&A, and we'll get to that. So I have a couple of questions actually. So I was wondering a little bit. This is maybe a nice starter. Why is Saskatchewan, or why are the prairies overlooked in the allocation of the government budgets? Manitoba seems to be doing very well. They've set aside a fund for natural infrastructure themselves, but the federal government seems to overlook Saskatchewan. Is that correct?
I won't be able to comment specifically on Saskatchewan, but the prairies typically have been left behind. And I think, as I said, it's a unique mix of small and medium-sized communities, and capacity is a significant challenge. So if you think of, communities that have a few thousand people, in some cases a few hundred people, their capacity to even access some of those federal funds are very limited. Many of these federal funds require, some studies to be in place. They require a bunch of paperwork, assessments to be done in advance of applying for funding. And so there are some barriers for the prairies accessing some of those programs. And again, our report wasn't comprehensive. We weren't doing a comprehensive scan of prairie projects. But definitely, Saskatchewan is probably the furthest behind in many ways, even amongst the three prairie provinces. We're seeing a lot more happening in Alberta and Manitoba. And in Manitoba, we're very lucky to have this fund that's been set aside by the provincial government. But without that kind of injection of funding, the prairies remain undercapacitated and have trouble accessing some of the federal programs.
Okay. Thank you. Another question, which is maybe a little bit more difficult to answer. So you also gave an overview in your slide of the different funding sources related to some of the benefits, and you pointed out that the benefits that are easy to quantify typically resort to private funding, and then there's a bunch of these indirect benefits that rely more on public funding and philanthropy you mentioned. So my question is, those indirect benefits, like lowering costs, for example, lowering damage costs, for example, they are there, but I was wondering, they are typically also quite difficult to capture. So I was wondering a little bit, when you talk about these finance mechanisms, to what extent these finance mechanisms are actually able to capture basically those benefits. How do you initiate a cash flow from the beneficiaries? So there are clearly beneficiaries, but how do you initiate a cash flow from these beneficiaries, especially for those indirect benefits?
I mean, thanks for that question. It is a tricky one. I think more and more adaptation is becoming a priority for many local governments because they're seeing clearly the impacts of climate events. So in smaller municipalities, these are, as I said in one of my slides, these are just highways being washed out, or a culvert, or a small, pipe system breaking down again and again because there's too much water, and highways are closed and there are road closures, and those then have economic implications on those communities. So a change in that, ensuring that, so in that one example where I talked about, I think it was Parkland County, investing in, bioengineered, bank replacement, and they could see an actual reduction in their operation and maintenance costs for that stretch of highway. So these kind of things have become a lot more quantifiable. And so when we are talking about bonds or financial instruments that focus on improved resilience or a reduction in risk, there are more and more ways to quantify them because communities themselves are able to provide the evidence that the impact of the flood of 10 years ago is different from the impact of the flood of 3 years ago. And the thing we did between 10 years and 3 years is ensure that some of that natural infrastructure was in place. These ecosystems are protecting us. and that evidence base is now growing.
Okay, great. We have a question in the Q&A box. It's an anonymous attendee who asks, do you have a source of sample municipal business cases for natural infrastructure?
Not off the top of my head. I know that, as I said, a lot of natural asset inventories are being done right now, and our partners at the Natural Asset Initiative, previously MNAI, now NAI, have been kind of helping specific municipalities with first conducting their asset inventory, and then when municipalities have more that they'd like to do, building kind of value propositions and a business case. So we can definitely send you, if you are willing to share your email address, we'll see if there's a business case that we'd like to highlight and share it with you. There are definitely a number of them. We're working ourselves in the South Saskatchewan Basin, building some kind of quantified outcomes and talking about some of the values there. And we've done some of this work in asset by asset in the past, but we can look for a municipal one and share it if that's of interest.
Okay. If you don't mind, you can share it with us maybe, and then if I don't know who this person is, but then just reach out to Julie Grand, and then we can share that information with you. Maybe one last question, because it's almost 1 o'clock here. So you were also making a reference to some of the asset accounting. So actually a colleague here on campus, Joanna Aikem, I don't know if you know her from the Intact Center. She's hosting.
Well.
Yeah, so there's this series of natural asset accounting and trying to include these values in the account. So you're also involved in those events.
We are. We've signed up for some of those. So yeah, so natural assets are not typically incorporated into public service accounting systems. So they're not, if they're not considered on a municipality's books, they are not maintained. You can't allocate funding for maintaining them. However, that's something that groups like the Intact Center have spearheaded to ensure that natural assets are in fact incorporated into public service accounting systems. And this is slowly happening. So municipalities have now started doing them on a voluntary basis. And I think there are enough voices, and we've chimed in as well. We've been signatories on letters that Joanna and others have led on this front. And it's definitely something that is gaining momentum. But even while it hasn't been done officially, there is a lot of movement, and a lot of municipalities are already doing this on a voluntary basis.
Great. Happy to hear this. We're 2 minutes to the hour. I don't see a question anymore in the Q&A box. Dimple, thank you so much for joining us today, all the way from India. It was a fantastic story. Thanks so much for sharing your experiences. Also, thanks to your communications officer for sharing the links to the various reports. I believe they are very, very interesting, and they will be of great use for the people that were participating today. Those of you who participated, thanks again for being with us during this webinar. This was the last webinar before the summer. We're going to take a break and then decide whether or not we're going to come back in September. Keep an eye on our website where you register for the webinar series. If we come back in September, we'll try to announce that as soon as possible. Thank you all for joining us today. Thanks all for being with us, and Dimple, all the best. Safe travels back to Canada, and thanks so much for giving a presentation today.
Thanks for having me. Bye all.
Thank you, everyone.